Hello students, today we're going to look at the institution of education. We're going to try and understand its importance to modern societies, but more importantly we're going to try to explore the kind of social inequalities that mar the educational system in modern societies. So modern systems of schooling and higher education was born out of the process of industrialization and urbanization. Prior to modernity, transmission of knowledge was not a formalized and a spatially distinct activity. Children learned practical skills within families and households, and craft skills actually entailed long years of apprenticeship with master craftsmen. Sacred knowledge was esoteric, which means it wasn't accessible to all, generally limited to the priestly class or the upper echelons of society. Now, the promise of modern secular education was the promise of modernity itself, which was development, progress, prosperity, and individual self-actualization and freedom. Right? So all the things that modernity promised, it actually promised through a secular education system. Modern education is posited as a universal solution to all kinds of social problems, ranging from poverty, crime, and unemployment, to the bridging of gender, class, racial, and ethnic inequalities, and the creation of a nationalist culture. The dominant perspective in sociology for a very long time on education was the functionalist perspective. The functionalist school of thought emerged as one of the most important schools of thought to document education and its importance in early sociological thinking. According to Durkheim, who's a classical sociologist, education was essential to the socialization of children so that they learn the norms and values of society and the moral codes of behavior that are required for a fully functional society. Education instills moral values and creates a sense of homogeneity sufficient for the functioning of society. Now, this is important because generally modern societies have a lot of differentiation. There are multiple differences and diversities. So education provides a space to create a certain kind of homogeneity in values and moral codes for society to function. Learning of history was seen as an integrative force in society, contributing to social solidarity. Now, functionalists generally tend to emphasize three fundamental functions of education. The first is that it developed the human resource of a modern industrial society. Modern industrial society is characterized by a complex division of labor and functional specialization, which means there are more occupations and which require technical expertise. So education was a way for which individuals would learn these specific skills and be able to function in the industrial economy. Second, education played an important allocative function of matching skills and capacity with jobs, right? So say for instance in schools, examinations, grades, and performance reports became mechanisms of routine sort of evaluation, and this sort of made it made possible the judgment of performance and became a determinant of future job prospects. So depending on how you scored in these examinations, the marks would determine how you would fare in broader society in the job market. Generally, the individuals with a higher score tends to get recruited in highly skilled jobs, whereas low skilled jobs passes on to the ones who score lower. Educational attainment therefore became an index of greater capacity for high skilled labor. The third aspect of education was that it was necessary to develop a moral consensus in society. A common cultural heritage, despite class and ethnic differences among pupils, helps in the creation of social cohesion and solidarity. Parsons had argued that education was necessary to inculcate values of individual achievement and merit, because you see in families you're generally inculcated into particularistic values based on certain ascriptive aspects like your gender, your religion, etc. Right? But the education system, it espouses universal standards where a child's status depended on his merit and achievements. Now, some of the critiques of the functionalist perspective. Now, critics have pointed out that the fit between skills required for jobs and the skills learned at school were tenuous at best, which means there wasn't really a fit between the skills they learned at schools and what they needed for jobs. While an educational degree could qualify one to do a job, it does not necessarily make one proficient at it. Ascribed status based on gender, class, race, and able-bodiedness had an impact on the experience and achievement of pupils in educational institution, which the functionalist perspectives fails to articulate. It does not take into account the inequality that is there in educational systems. Educational institutions reflected dominant values and could encourage sexist, racist, and class bias among students. Functionalists failed to carve out nuances of power working in educational institutions. Now, as a remedy to the problems of the functionalist perspective, we are going to look at certain conflictual and critical perspectives on education which actually foreground the issue of inequality in educational institutions. We're going to look at the theories of Bowles and Gintis, Ivan Illich, Bernstein, and Pierre Bourdieu. Bowles and Gintis offered a critical reading of education by comparing it to industrial capitalism. So just like industrial capitalism involves the fragmentation of labor in factories, hierarchical relationships, as well as supervision, in a similar fashion, like workers, students in an educational institution experience rigidity of hierarchical authority and fragmentation of task. Fragmentation of knowledge into specific subjects and disciplines divorced from each other in schools is akin to fragmentation of tasks in factories. Students cannot exercise much choice over their curriculum and have very little decision-making powers in the learning process. Students study for grades rather than for the sake of learning or for the sake of enhancing their knowledge. Social divisions like gender, race, or class affect the kind of learning a student can experience. Working class schools may be distinct from elite schools in their orientation. So what happens generally in working class schools, they are taught to be more obedient, to follow rules and regulations, and to be generally docile. So preparing sort of, a set of future workers in factories. But in case of elite schools, they encourage leadership qualities. So both these schools then actually produce very different kinds of students who would then be stationed very differently in the broader society. So differential treatment and expectations from students reproduces class inequality between the working class and the elites. Schools also seem to legitimize this inequality. How do they do it? Educational institutions, they tend to give the impression that they are places of fair competition and that they value merit and, they only award the deserving candidate. And hence what happens is that the inequality in grades and performance may be seen as a natural outcome of abilities and capacities of students, right? So in that instance, when privileged ones succeed in schools, they think that they are being rewarded for their efforts and abilities, and those subordinate people who do not succeed, right, are compelled to see it as a personal failure. So the reason for failure is sought in the student rather than in the system which privileges certain people over other people, right? Pupils' lack of intelligence, ability to succeed is often experienced as a personal shortcoming rather than the broader framework of educational institutions limiting their prospects. Now, there are some critiques of this theorization which tries to draw parallels between industrial capitalism and the schooling system. One is that it sort of emphasizes only on class distinctions and ignores gender, race, and other structures of inequality. Another is it, of course, ignores positive outcomes. I mean, the idea that modern schooling is not all bad, because education does allow the possibility of fulfillment, liberation, and also providing occupational returns, that once you are done with education, you do have access to better jobs. So this assumption of an easy correspondence between schooling and economic relations ignores how reproduction of inequality in the education system may involve challenges and negotiations that is not an automatic process of replication of the capitalist system of production. So this parallel is not so as simple as the theorists tend to assume. Another interesting perspective on education is provided by Ivan Illich. Now, he provides a very powerful critique of compulsory schooling. He says that, of course, there is, like Bowles and Gintis, he also points out that there is a link between education and the economy, and they produce discipline and hierarchy in students which will be useful for the economy, and they encourage a kind of passive consumption of the existing order. because of the kind of routines that exist in school, because of obligatory attendance and the regimentation that they implement within schools. School perform the task of keeping children off the street to later slot them into occupational roles, thus reproducing the dominant forms of inequality. Now, Ivan Illich is particularly important because he provides us with the concept of the hidden curriculum, right? That the hidden curriculum, it plays an important role in instilling in the student codes of conducts and ethos that sustain the dominant structure of the society. So it teaches things like punctuality, it teaches role following, it teaches obedience, right? These are things that are a part of the hidden curriculum. You're not directly taught them, but the routines and the procedures of school make you imbibe and internalize these forms of hidden curriculum. Learning does not require, Ivan Illich is very critical of, learning in which, the teacher is made the center of everything, right? The teacher is your custodian guiding ritual at school. He's a moralist indoctrinating people about what is right and what is wrong, and also is a therapist who interferes in your personal lives. So the idea is that where is the creative freedom and self-motivated learning of the students? If the teacher is central and the teacher determines the entire process of education, then where is the autonomy of the students and the creativity of the students, he asks. Ivan Illich goes on to argue for an abolishment of the modern school and provides alternate methods to learning. He thinks that education should not be limited to our childhood or adolescent years. In fact, there should be no link between education and age. It should be a lifelong process, and anyone who wants to study anything can study at any given point of time without being subject to routines, attendance, as well as a standard curriculum. So what is it that he advocates for real learning outside of the school? For him, he advocates a world of things and material resources. He advocates the existence of people who can serve as role models for skills and values, engaged peers who are willing to challenge, argue, compete, cooperate, and understand together, and finally, exceptional elders who can provide feedback and care. So according to him, he has a certain kind of an educational infrastructure in mind, which is nothing like the modern schooling system, which should involve reference services to educational objects for formal learning, which can be stored in libraries, rental agencies, laboratories, or showrooms like museums and theaters, skill exchange where role models can enlist their skills, and conditions of service and contact addresses for those willing to learn, peer matching, that is creating a communication network among peers who are interested in similar learning activity, and reference services to educators at large, including professionals, freelancers who also enlist in a directory their contact address and terms of service, which anyone who wants to learn can then contact and have access to it at their own time in their own suitable convenience. Now, at some level, this appears utopian. However, in a world of information technology, and of course now a world reeling with environmental disasters, including the pandemic, which has made social distance mandatory, I think that a self-motivated, easily accessible form of education, for instance via the internet, does seem possible and not so utopian after all. Another important conflict perspective is by Basil Bernstein. Now, he focused on linguistic skills to understand inequality among students. Linguistic capabilities, according to him, play a key role in reproducing unequal structures of power and privileges within educational institutions. Children from different social backgrounds learn different language codes or forms of speech, which has an impact on their education performance. He introduces the concept of restricted and elaborate code to emphasize the ways in which educational institutions often cater to the elaborate code and not the restricted code. Now, what is the restricted code? Working class children tend to speak in a restricted code. Their speech contains unstated assumptions that others are expected to know. It is a product of strong familial working class neighborhood where norms and values are taken for granted and reinforced through rewards and punishment rather than explicit articulation in language. Speech in restricted code caters to practical experience and fails to communicate abstract ideas, theoretical propositions, and processes or relationships. So all the things that you may need to succeed in an educational institution is something that is not provided by the restricted code to working class children. These codes are observed among working class children and peers where norms are implicit and there isn't a need to explain their behavioral codes. Now, in contrast, the language of middle class children often involve an elaborate code, which allows speakers to be fairly creative and use a range of linguistic alternatives. It enables children to suit their speech to different situations. This form of speech is not bound to specific context and permits the child to communicate in general terms and articulate abstract ideas and theoretical propositions. A middle class child is frequently offered explanations or principles that underlie particular behavioral expectations. For instance, reasons for avoiding too much sugar, such as bad health or tooth decay, unlike a working class child who may simply be told off for doing so. Children who are equipped with the elaborate code are better able to cope with the demands of the educational system and have the potential to perform better than those who have the restricted codes. There is an affinity then between educational institutions and the elaborate code, right? And those who belong to socio-economic backgrounds with the restricted code, they tend to become underachievers in the modern schooling system. They struggle to understand formal abstract language of academic disciplines and may find classroom teaching incomprehensible. While they may still manage rote learning, they may have genuine difficulties in grasping conceptualizations. So this is the difference between the restricted and the elaborate code. Elaborate code working better with educational institutions. Another way in which inequality has been explored in educational systems is by a critique of the education system by Bourdieu. Now, the thrust of Bourdieu's argument lay in the claim that educational institutions function to add legitimacy to class inequalities. In order to succeed in the educational institutions, students must possess cultural capital and higher class habitus. What are habitus? They are unconscious class dispositions and ways of understanding the world and one's place in it. Cultural capital refers to a familiarity with the dominant culture. It involves a variety of sources, such as the ability to understand and use educated language, general cultural awareness, information about school systems, and academic credentials. So if you have cultural capital, there's a way in which you can navigate the school system better than those who do not. Acquiring cultural capital, of course, requires time, energy, and economic capital, so which then can be used to attain high status jobs and incomes. It is thus unequally distributed across social classes depending on one's family. So generally, children from upper class and middle class have more cultural capital, which is passed on to them by their parents, while working class children do not have the requisite cultural capital to actually perform well in schools. And it has then been seen that most high degrees in France are held by children of professionals rather than factory workers, because parents transmit their cultural capital to children, which helps them perform better in educational institutions. Working class children are disadvantaged in such a system because of their lack of cultural capital. The focus on merit and fair competition makes inevitable the failure of working class students, making it personal and legitimate, something that Bowles and Gintis have also pointed out. Students from higher social classes, through their educational attainment, are able to maintain their dominant position in society, and they feel that they deserve to do so. So what happens is that people with greater cultural capital coming from higher social classes are able to do well in education and then get better jobs, which means that they continue to maintain their class position over and above the working class who fail to perform as well as them in the educational system because they lack the requisite cultural capital. The educational institution then merely reproduces the class status quo. When a working student performs well, in some instances, of course, there are exceptions to the rule, it only strengthens the misrecognition of an unequal system as that one that is based on merit and provides equal opportunities. Bourdieu's framework of cultural reproduction has been useful to understand the persistence of caste inequality and prejudice in the Indian education system, despite affirmative action or reservations at all levels to ensure better access to socially backward castes. So just like the education system can reproduce class inequalities, scholars in India have also tried to understand how education can also reproduce caste inequalities because of the dominance of the upper caste in the educational systems and the struggle of the lower caste to actually perform well because of their historical backwardness and disprivileges. So what happens is then that the educational system then becomes a site of the reproduction of caste inequalities, like class inequalities, as Bourdieu has talked about. We will not try and understand the relationship between gender and education. Is there a way in which education systems also sort of produce certain kinds of gender ideologies and gender inequality? Are they patriarchal is the question to ask, really. In contemporary societies, gender equality is an important goal, and the domain of education is a significant arena in its achievement. Nandati Manjrekar notes, and I quote her, "In a wider sense, notions of femininity and masculinity, what is appropriate and expected behavior on the part of girls and women and boys and men, influence decisions about sending children to school, what they should be taught, and for what period they should be kept in school. They also influence subject choices and preferences at higher levels of education and post-education opportunities in the labor market. There is ample evidence to suggest the prevalence of bias, discrimination, and stereotyping of girls and women in the educational institutions. Feminists have pointed out that there exists a hidden curriculum of gender in education that seeks to reproduce the broader gender relations in society. The hidden curriculum includes, among others, the existence of a gender-appropriate dress code in schools, which perpetuates gender stereotypes, where clothes, for instance, are linked to decency, morality, behavioral expectations, and even vulnerability to sexual violence. Feminist studies have demonstrated how school textbooks are redolent with gendered images, right? Now, what are these gendered images? Boys are portrayed as autonomous individuals with initiative and ambition and are associated with the world outside, right? Generally, boys are shown in stories to be a part of the public world, and girls are shown to be passive, others-oriented, and generally associated with the home and domestic spaces. In most textbooks, if you will notice, the universal human subject is gendered male, which means that when you read the textbook, you continuously see the use of the pronouns him and he, right? So the addressee of these textbooks is generally assumed to be a male member. These books are sources of secondary socialization into socially accepted gender roles. More prestigious subjects and arenas of learning tend to be associated with men, right? So again, you see there is a kind of division of disciplines in terms of gender. The idea is that men will choose engineering disciplines, or they will choose the hard sciences, and women would pursue humanities and social sciences. And this is not common. If you enter a science class, you will automatically see that there are more male students. And likewise, in a subject like sociology, interestingly, if you enter a sociology classroom, you will see that almost 70% of students are actually girls. So there seems to be a way in which the educational system seems to encourage men and women to choose particular subjects. Society also plays an important role in this through anticipatory socialization. In India, for instance, education of girls from poor communities, including Dalit, Adivasi Muslims, and other minority groups, remains a challenge. The gender gap in literacy rates in India, according to Census 2011, is 16.6%, which means that male literacy rate is 82.1%, whereas female literacy rate is 65.4%. So this continues to be a substantial gender gap in education. Although there is a very interesting positive trend that has been seen the world over in the performance of girls, which is that they do better in examination than boys, and there are various reasons for it. One is, of course, the impact of women's movement and the presence of female role models, which has instilled confidence in young girls who want to challenge traditional sort of stereotypes and not become sort of, homemakers, but actually pursue a career and, sort of obtain higher education. Another reason is that there seems to be a different style in which men and women, boys and girls study. And it seems that generally girls take their studies more seriously, they are more organized and more mature about it than boys who are seen to be more sort of disruptive in the classroom and not interested. And linked to this is the idea that there are certain group of boys in schools who actually display anti-education and sort of anti-learning attitudes, which means that they reject education and they think that to study and to learn is very uncool. So these are the reasons why actually girls have been performing better in various examinations. Now, despite positive trends, women continue to be underrepresented in higher education, and this exclusion is often intersectional, which means that women's access to education is affected by considerations of race, of class, of caste, and of ability. So which means that women of color, working class women, lower caste women, disabled women are generally at they stand to lose within the modern education system. To conclude, I would want to say that while education can play a very important role in societal development and progress, and actually the creation of a more equal and egalitarian society where everybody has equal opportunities for self-actualization and to develop themselves, but in actuality, sociologists have demonstrated how educational institutions can become sites for reproduction of inequalities. Inequalities in the form of class inequalities, caste inequalities, gender inequalities, right? And perpetuates the status quo. Thank you.